Hello BookTube. Today for Tag Tuesday, I will be doing the What Makes a Classic tag. This tag was created by Mark of Book Time with Elvis, inspired by a blog post on the Penn Macmillan website asking what makes a classic. So alongside 8 prompts that feature sort of your common elements of a classic work of literature, or at least a certain form of a classic work of literature, the question is asked, well, what do you think makes a classic? So my definition of a classic is a work that endures over the decades and centuries and even millennia. So a work endures in popularity, although perhaps diminished. A work that endures by being taught in schools, both at the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels. A work that endures by being a part of various conversations amongst the critics, scholars, and future artists. So I think that's basically what makes a classic. So there are 8 prompts. I decided to limit myself to works that I have in my personal library. I've also picked for a few of the prompts, I've picked 2 books rather than just one. And as a caveat, I don't find myself drawn to the classics as much as I have been over, well, let me rephrase that. I'm not drawn to the classics. It's been a very long time since I could claim that I've been particularly drawn to the classics. Then that would have been my late teen and early 20s, so about when I was in college, and that would have been about, say, 17 to about 23. I was thinking about maybe being a bit more generous with the rounding and 15 to 25, but I don't think it lasted that long. And I haven't really found myself drawn to wanting to read the classics since then. Although there are points when I think maybe I should, but when I get those feelings, it never quite turns out well. But just because I don't necessarily find myself drawn to the classics doesn't mean I can't necessarily do this tag. And for that matter, I could probably have done a whole sort of weirder answers for these prompts than what I'm going to give. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and do the answers now. So for prompt number 1, the one with a gripping plot and universal theme. So for this, I'm going with 2 books. First is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. This is a classic of early 20th century American literature. It's about the Joad family, a family of farmers living in Oklahoma who become insolvent with the Dust Bowl and the sort of thing with farmers and taking on too much debt, and then a year's worth of bad harvests just ruining them financially. So in order to survive, the Joads move to California, where they are told, or they believe, that there are agricultural jobs aplenty for people like them. And when they get to California, that's not quite what they thought it was going to be. I read this when I was I think I was probably about 17, maybe 18. I know I picked it up when I was 16 and read it had to go at it shortly after I bought it, bounced hard on the first chapter, and then came back to it a year or so later and managed to finish it. So I think I remember it quite fondly. But of course, I think this definitely, whether I like it or not, it is a classic. I probably really should at some point have another go at it, because that's why I bought it last year. Anyway. Okay, so my other pick for this book or for this prompt is a work of history, which, thinking about it, you could probably do this without necessarily having too much mind for classics. But anyway, so for the work of history I picked A Distant Mirror by Barbara W. Tuchman. So this is a history of 14th century France, namely France during the Hundred Years' War, the early part of the Hundred Years' War, and the first phases of the Black Death, as well as the social upheaval of the Jacquerie. And the book follows a French nobleman, Enguerrand de Coucy, the seventh, if I remember correctly, who ends up becoming the son-in-law of King Edward III. Enguerrand marries Edward's eldest daughter. And this is a fascinating book. It's universal themes, of course. It's got a riveting plot. And so I think this book definitely fits the prompt. Prompt number 2 is the subversive one. For this, I also have 2 books, both works of science fiction. Science fiction and fantasy are my favorite genres of fiction. So I picked the first book is Dune by Frank Herbert. So this is a classic space opera. It's about Paul Atreides, the young heir to the dukedom of Caladan. His father, Duke Leto, has incurred the wrath, the jealousy of the emperor of the known universe, who works with House Harkonnen, who are longtime rivals of Duke Leto, to force the Atreides to give up their home planet of Caladan for the planet Arrakis, the most valuable planet in the universe, because there's a special spice called melange produced on the planet that allows for a number of miracle drugs. Most notably, it gives a spacing guild the ability to predict safe, pretty much to navigate safely from one point to another in a universe that disallows for higher artificial intelligences. And so House Atreides takes over Arrakis from the Harkonnens, and while the Atreides believe that they are starting to succeed in their assumption of the fiefdom, the Harkonnens return, supported by several legions of the Emperor's own troops, and the Atreides are defeated. Paul and his mother, Jessica, a member of the Bene Gesserit, flee into the desert to seek refuge with the Fremen, native inhabitants of the planet who resist all claims to authority over them. And gradually, Paul rises to a position of influence in using his genetic engineering. His mother is a member of the Bene Gesserit, order of women who, as one of their agendas, seek to create a male Bene Gesserit with the predictive powers of a guild navigator. I think that's what their plan is. And eventually to set this Kwisatz Haderach as emperor. Unfortunately for everybody involved, it ends up being Paul rather than his alternate universe's daughter, had he been born a girl and married to hopefully Feyd-Rautha and not Rabban. But anyway, so this book is subversive in a way because while on the surface, Dune is your standard hero story, that Paul is a hero, he's a messiah. But Herbert tries to subvert that, in that, no, Paul's really a monster. So yeah, so that's I would say how this fits into the version, is that the intent is that Paul is really a monster, although I don't think Herbert really quite hits it out of the park. I mean, he's much better with, I mean, it's more obvious with God Emperor of Dune than he is here in Dune. But anyway, equally, I'm not entirely sure if she hits it out of the park in the subversion, is The Dispossessed by Ursula K. LeGuin. This is also a work of space opera. It's about a scientist who is developing a method of faster-than-light communications. His home planet of Anaris doesn't really know what to do with him. He doesn't quite know what to do here. He doesn't feel like he belongs. So he leaves to go to so basically in this setting, there's a planet, and then a moon called Anaris. So one of the rebel group from one of the countries on the planet basically flee to the moon and set up a new society, which is meant to be anarchic, although it has its own forms of authoritarianism, which the main character doesn't feel too comfortable with. So he then moves to the home planet because he thinks he'll have better success there. It turns out poorly, and eventually he dissatisfactorily goes to Earth, which is fairly authoritarian because humans have pretty much screwed up the environment so much that basically, yeah, the only option they had was to absolute control or something. Anyway, it's been a very long time since I've read this book, but I think LeGuin is trying to subvert kind of the notions of society and freedom and that sort of thing. And I don't quite see hits it out of the park, but I could be wrong. I mean, it's been a very long time since I've read it. It's been about almost 20 years, and I don't quite remember a whole lot about it. I probably should give this another go at some point, but I don't know when. And although I do remember, much like with Dune, that I fought with LeGuin while I was reading this book. So anyway, but I think they both would fit as subversions, don't you? Prompt number 3, the one which defines a time and a place. I'm not entirely happy with this choice, but I don't think I really have any other option that I have in my collection. So I'm going to go with this anyway. And that is Burgher's Daughter by Nadine Gordimer. So this is a book about a young woman named Rosa Burgher, whose parents are anti-apartheid activists. They are oppositional, or they're in the South African opposition. And both of them have been arrested, and Rosa basically has to navigate her life without bringing too much attention to herself and trying to find her place in the world. And I think this maybe will work. I don't know. It's been a while since I've read it, and I didn't quite get on with it, but I didn't really have any other options that immediately stood out to me. So that's Burgher's Daughter. Prompt number 4, the complex, groundbreaking one. So for this, I'm going to echo Gareth of Book Songs and Other Magic, who selected The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. He actually picked the first part of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, but I'm going to go with the whole novel, or trilogy, however you want to define The Lord of the Rings. So, The Lord of the Rings, which probably doesn't need much of a introduction, is the progenitor of fantasy as we know it. The conventions, the style, all of it, all of what makes modern and contemporary fantasy, especially epic fantasy, is rooted in The Lord of the Rings. So this definitely is classic material, if ever there was one. Even with the tendency, as Steve Donahue mentions, that science fiction and fantasy both has the tendency to eat its own. That there isn't really much opportunity for classics because they're not, older works of science fiction and fantasy aren't really kept in circulation, and its fandom is largely limited to coteries of older fans, I would think. But anyway. Prompt number 5. The ones with the archetypal characters. How about we go with an allegory? The Faerie Queene by Edmund Spenser. So this is a long romantic poem that recasts the Arthurian myths into an allegory of Elizabethan England. In the first story, or the first part, there's a knight called the Red Cross Knight, who is meant to be St. George, who is meant to be England. Of course, there are various iterations of Queen Elizabeth. There's the Faerie Queene, there's Britomart, there is, I think Una also counts as Elizabeth, although she also counts as the Church of England. And then there's Duessa, which is the Roman Catholic Church, is also probably Mary, Queen of Scots, so on and so forth. So this is very archetypal heavy. Although how much longer this book is going to remain a classic, I don't know. I had one of my goals for March of the Mammoths this year was to actually finally read the whole of the Faerie Queene, and it did not go well. Prompt number 6. The one that's a complete one-off. So for this, I'm going to go with A City of Night by John Ritchie. So I know Ritchie's written other novels, but I think none of them hold even a candle to City of Night. So City of Night is a novel about a young man who travels across the country from El Paso to, I think he eventually ends up in New Orleans. But he goes basically like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New Orleans, elsewhere, as a rent boy, as a male prostitute, who gradually over the course of the novel comes to some realizations about himself that he hadn't really thought of before. It's been a very long time since I've read this book. Anyway, so prompt number 7. The one that we quote from all the time. Oh, I did not pull anything out for this prompt. I completely forgot about it. I don't really have an answer. I don't think I really have anything that's really all that quotable. Except for maybe something from Shakespeare, but I don't think that really would work. So let's pass it up and go on to prompt number 8. So prompt number 8 has 2 parts, which is why I picked 2 books for this one. One is the ReDiscover Classic, or the book you believe should be a classic in the future. So for the ReDiscover Classic, I'm going to go with a work of fantasy, and that would be at least the Conan stories of Robert E. Howard. I think they should definitely. I mean, there are certainly classics of science fiction and fantasy. Howard created the sword and sorcery genre of fantasy, and of course, the Conan stories have endured in popularity for nearly a century now, with some ups and downs. But compared to the rest of sword and sorcery, much more successful. So I definitely think the Conan stories should stick around. And for a future classic, I'm going to go with Fullmetal Alchemist by Hiromu Arakawa. This is a manga series that came out about a little more than 20 years ago now. It's about two brothers, Edward and Alphonse Elric, who are prodigy alchemists who are grievously mutilated when they attempt human transmutation. They want to bring their deceased mother back to life, and it fails miserably. Edward loses a leg, and Alphonse loses his body. In order to save Alphonse's life, Edward sacrifices an arm to transcribe Alphonse's soul onto a suit of armor. A few years after this event, Edward becomes a state alchemist, and he and his brother go in search of the Philosopher's Stone, an alchemical artifact reputed to be able to bypass the law of equivalent exchange so that they can get their bodies back. However, during their journey across the country of Amestris in search of the Philosopher's Stone, they not only learn the horrible truth of the Philosopher's Stone, but they also learn that there is a ancient, long-running conspiracy going to the very heart of the Amestrian government that sees both brothers and their allies as important ingredients for, or important human sacrifices for, the promised day. This series is phenomenal, and I absolutely think it should be a classic of manga in the future. So that was the What Makes a Classic tag. If you would like to do this tag, consider yourselves tagged, and I will be back hopefully tomorrow with some more videos, or at least a video, I don't know. I know I was meaning to create my own tag yesterday, but I got distracted by some adulting I had to do. I had a few errands I had to run. So hopefully I'll be able to do, probably maybe later this week I'll do that tag. Although the tag I was wanting to do didn't quite turn out because a similar tag had been created last year. So I'm going to do the other one I was thinking of doing. And anyway, so until I see you tomorrow, hopefully, thank you, BookTube. Have a great afternoon and stay safe.